We're now recording, and I will now share screen, Lydia. Hang on a moment.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and being patient while we get started there. We're really pleased to welcome you for our second Black Adoption Project webinar. Hopefully many of you may have been here in December when we had our first webinar. Before we get going today, I just want to do some introductions of those speakers that we've got with us today. My name is Lydia. I'm the Head of Service of Adopt London North, representing Adopt London on this project. And Laurelle?
I'm Laurelle Brown, so I'm Director of Laurelle Brown Training and Consultancy, and we're partnering with Adopt London and other stakeholders in the project to deliver the Black Adoption Project.
Fantastic, and we're really grateful to two fantastic panelists that have joined us to share their thoughts today. Can I go to Beverley? Would you mind introducing yourself?
Hello, thanks, Lydia. My name is Beverley Barnett-Jones. I'm a registered social worker coming to my 31 years this year, and I work as Associate Director for the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory, focusing on practice and impacts in the system and the child's journey before, during and after the family justice intervention. So that's me.
Brilliant.
And I love this project.
We're so grateful to have you with us. Thank you, Bev. And Yewande.
Well, hello, my name is Dr. Yewande Okuleye. I'm an academic, but also I'm a practitioner. I've done lots of projects where we've been working on co-production. So my interest is in co-production methodology, but also social justice and Blackness.
Thank you so much, and we're really looking forward to hearing some of your reflections later. So before we get going with the presentation, just for those who may not have joined us before, the Black Adoption Project is a partnership between Adopt London and Laurelle Brown Training and Consultancy. Adopt London is a partnership of 4 regional adoption agencies, and we cover adoption services for 24 London boroughs. It's a long-term project, and if you did miss our first webinar, we will be sharing links to that and our phase 1 report as well in the chat as we go through today. So this afternoon even, we wanted to focus a little bit on our theory of change process. This is a process that we have been through in the last year, and we thought it'd be of real interest to share both the process itself, how we arrived at the process, our learning from the process, as well as the actual outcomes and the output that we produced and how that's going to influence the project going forwards. Please use the chat as we go through, because we're going to have several points where we take questions, and any questions that we don't get to, we will still look over and we'll feed into the work of the project as we go through. So very briefly, as many of you will be aware, disparities for Black children in the adoption system has been a stuck problem in the UK for decades. Recent studies and insights suggest that despite a huge amount of anti-racism related comms in recent year, understanding of these issues remains very limited. Commitment to tackle racism is varied, and racial oppression and inequalities persist across systems. We believe in London that we have a unique opportunity and responsibility to address this issue because of the proportion of Black children in the adoption system who are within our boroughs in London. We know that this needs long-term commitment, that it's not something that can be changed easily or overnight. And we also know that it's something that has to be addressed with a wide range of partners and stakeholders, not on our own. In our first webinar, we shared the findings from our research report. So if you haven't already looked at that, we recommend going back and having a look at our findings. Thank you, Laurelle.
Okay, so I'm just going to talk you through the theory of change process, and then we'll break, as Lydia said, just to hear from you, but also our wonderful guests today. So why a theory of change process? This visual, I think, really captures why a theory of change process is important. As an organisation, as a consultancy, our team, our work focuses on collaborating with organisations in the children's sector to try and embed equity and inclusion change across complex systems. And what we know from our work is when you are trying to affect change in that arena, if you don't have a theory or a logic or an idea of the steps you are taking, you are really maximising your chances of failure or nothing changing. So what we wanted to do was kick off the process and avoid that question mark that you'll see on the screen there in the middle of that logic model, and kick off the process by identifying what the pitfalls might be. Why hasn't this worked before? Why has this been a stuck issue for so long? And how might we achieve some positive change despite the complexity and the systems we're navigating? So what from the beginning of this project, it would have been very easy to be overwhelmed by the task essentially at hand, and we therefore did a theory of change to really engage in a structured process that enabled us to question what is the issue, what are our assumptions, to bring together our ideas and then develop a theory specific to the Black Adoption Project that we could then mobilise. So when we engaged in theory of change, we facilitated 3 workshops, and you'll see on the right of the screen. One was with a community group, which included community leaders, as you'll see, campaigners, and even political elected members, political representation, and that was in person. We also facilitated a group with people with different lived experience, so that included Black adoptive parents, as well as others that had a different connection to adoption, and that was in person. And we did a virtual group with Black adopted young people, and so through these steps we were able to develop a picture of, well, a better picture. I don't think we'll ever fully grasp the picture of complexity and the multiple stakeholders and actors and processes involved in the adoption space in London, but we certainly were able to get a better and clearer picture and really clarify what we felt is in our scope of influence, and also, I guess, what we had the ability to actually change, but we crucially were able to determine what is outside of our scope of influence, and also where we just don't have the capacity to even consider trying to affect change in those arenas. Through the theory of change process, we were then essentially able to critically reflect on those assumptions and our ideas and think more deeply about what are we trying to achieve, but also things that we take for granted. When you're doing these kind of collaborative projects, for us as a consultancy, where a lot of our work focuses on anti-racism and racial equity, we will often use what we might call buzzwords, things like anti-racism, things like equity, diversity and inclusion, stuff like community engagement, community empowerment. And through the theory of change process, we were able to start interrogating semantics, terminology, and also be challenged as a project team. Adopt London and my team as a project team were subject to challenge from participants in those workshops, which is necessary. The theory of change process then enabled us to collaboratively identify core goals for the project, an ultimate aim, and what we felt was important to do and was logical to do to try and achieve some change. But in the theory of change process, because we spent time really interrogating all of these things, we were also able to really spend time reflecting on complexity, this concept of complexity, and really I acknowledge that this is not a linear change process. We couldn't just identify these are 5 goals and actually let's just do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things over 5 years to get to these goals. It was very obvious through the theory of change process that, you know, all of the systems that we are navigating, from children's social care to regional adoption agencies, to communities, national policy, you know, there are so many systems, there are so many individuals, there are so many dynamics that are adaptive. You know, even throughout the time we've been going as a project, we've had national policy change, quite significant strategies, and we are adapting. And so our theory of change, you'll see the visual shortly, has tried to really respond to that constantly evolving, adaptive, complex ecosystem that we are within. So we had the workshops and we had loads, maybe even hundreds. I don't know, Lydia, if that's an exaggeration, but we quite literally
I don't think it was. Lots of paper.
Yeah. We had lots of post-it notes, which we had the fun task. So thank you, Victoria and Zaribe and Hannah Mahoney in particular from our team in, really sifting through those post-it notes to distill them into a fairly coherent spreadsheet, which was then further developed by the team into this, as you'll see on screen, which is our theory of change in spreadsheet form. And that enabled us to have a clear logical structure about our goals, what the activities are, and what we're trying to achieve. And that led to this visual. We collaborated with an illustrator, and it was important for us to also collaborate with a Black illustrator, which we were able to. And so thank you. And you'll see her neat details, Tamara Jade Kaz, in the top right. But this is what all of that work became. It was turned into a visual document. We felt it was important to have a very visual and engaging theory of change, because this is a project that ultimately is about benefiting children. And so if any stakeholder group needs to be able to access our theory of change and understand it, it needed to first and foremost be the children. And all of the work from the workshops, all of the information has directly informed the theory of change, and that included children and young people themselves. So this is the process that we went through and how we got to this point. So some of the strengths of the process, and then we'll just hear from Yewande, who participated in this process. There were lots of strengths, but also learning in the process, and I'll just very quickly touch on some of them. So strength was lived experience. We had lots of different experiences in the room. We also made sure we paid for those experiences. We paid for people's time and experience, and actually that led to some systems change within our own organisations, with us looking to ensure that people weren't waiting a long time to be paid their money, which typically is the case if we are dealing with local authorities sometimes. So we made sure we changed our processes and we simplified it so people were paid and they got their money very quickly, which was the strength of the process. Young people being able to share their unique experience and really challenge us, and also highlight things we wouldn't have thought of, was a massive strength for the process. Having community members and lots of esteemed community members like Yewande participate was incredibly powerful for us to hear directly from those that aren't working within the organisation. Having a whole day to really unpick all of our thoughts and be challenged and challenge just meant that we weren't rushing. And those of you who are used to doing theories of change may be used to some of the tokenistic approaches that typically we see, where they're very rushed. They're not meaningful. They don't involve the people that will actually be impacted by the said policy or project. And so having time, being able to slow down the pace, real strength. And evidence informed. The theory of change came after we did our research and our desktop reviews and our focus groups. And so that evidence informed the theory of change. Some of the learning, the distillation process. So again, I just mentioned Hannah and Victoria having to go through all of those post-it notes, and then multiple versions of theories of change, draft theories of change, is time consuming, and just an area of learning that actually is a lot easier in person. We tried to do a lot of that virtually, and it was very difficult. Also a lot of assumptions. If you have these processes taking place only with people working in an organisation, you will be finding yourself in an echo chamber, and that was a real emerging and prominently emerging theme from all of the workshops. There was so much that came out of those workshops that we would not have thought of, and it wouldn't have been reflected in the theory of change in the project had we not took that collaborative approach. And that speaks to that point on emergence, and that is also linked to complexity, where typically, because we are navigating complexity, emergence is going to be a characteristic of this project. And when we research and evaluate what we're doing, we need to be agile and able to respond to that. And finally, communication. There was a lot of learning about how we communicate the theory of change, and that's ultimately why we went with a very visual theory of change, supported by an underlying narrative, but primarily communicating to the right audience. And identifying that right audience, again, was another massive area of learning. So that is a whistle-stop tour through the theory of change process. I'm really keen to hear from you, Yewande, as somebody who participated in that, but also has a lot of professional experience with projects and collaborative processes. So I'll ask a couple of questions, and audience, if you could also use the chat, because we will take some questions from you. But the first question, Yewande, is co-producing the theory of change was important as a marker of how we want to do things differently in the Black Adoption Project. What are your reflections having participated, and did you feel there was value in this approach? And feel free to say no, even though Lydia and I are here.
Oh, thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this today. And my reflection is also to actually have the space to reflect. So I want to just say that for you to see that as a bonus, as part of this system, bring people to back after a while to reflect about it. So for me, it was a privilege to be part of, be in the room. And it was very powerful because I saw this really as me being like a participant observation, almost like ethnography. But the most important thing when we talk about co-production is it's actually the whole process, and what we're doing is in the language co-production. And if you see it as a production, like just like a production of a play. So if you're putting on a play, what's the most important things? You have the sets, you have the setting, you have the actors, you have the script, you have everything in there. So the most important thing for me was the setting, the set, that we were all Black academics, practitioners, because in that you have psychological safety, and that's maybe an assumption that people don't look into, that how safe are we in this room psychologically to be relaxed to ask those questions, or relaxed to just come up with. Most of the time I would just say, I have a thought, the thought's not formulated yet. But if you don't feel relaxed, or you feel that people might judge your expertise by coming up with these half-baked, tiny ideas, then you're not going to be speaking honestly or coming up with half-baked ideas. So that format allows people to come up with, do you know what? I'm just let's put a note and let's put that on a post-it, because we might come back to that later. That really is the empowerment of doing co-production in a space where your inarticulated ideas are valued. So that's a very important thing. And I think that happened because people in the room were new. We were strangers, so we didn't come with any preconceived ideas or expectation. So I think that was very successful for me, because I felt very confident with the group that I was with, that they were all experts in their own field, but we could come together and just come up with ideas that we can either bounce off each other or come up with ideas that we could put in a cooler and come back to later. That safety and that freedom was very, very important. And that's really the strength of co-production, that people come in and can actually speak frankly about what the issue was at hand. So that is a key strength. And I think that's something that I'm not sure if you've articulated in your report, that's having the actors from a Black cohort is important, because that Black leadership is what we want to cultivate all through the project. So I envisage this as, the Black leaders, but also one thing that was of value for me was I was very unaware of the issues in adoption. I came in and was actually astounded that, oh my God, this is a problem. But on the flip side of that, for us to understand that we need to see all the problems regarding the socioeconomic, the housing, there's all an intersection. So once I got over the shock of, oh, this is another area where we need to do work, it's like, okay, how do we now think of it from an intersectional way? So we had the cohort of people working, but we also had a strong facilitator, that was going to help us challenge our own assumptions. So you need that dynamic to work together. And it worked very well. It worked very well where there was these checks and balances where we were coming up with ideas, but also challenging us, and also for us to think about the language we're using. Because if you're using something, if you're creating something different and you want change, you have to come with new language for the problems. Because sometimes we come with the old language, do research, but actually we've got a problem that's actually mutated right in front of us without us understanding the language. So those are the things that were of value for me to be in the room. Yeah, that's the first. I think those are the most cogent points. I made some points. If I think about them later, then I'll come back. Yeah. Non-hierarchical. I put it's non-hierarchical. It felt like it was a non-hierarchical flat structure. So not sure how successful it would be if you bring people in the same organization and the hierarchy plays itself out there, and people that won't necessarily speak truth to power don't do that. Yeah, I think that's a key thing that the notes that I kind of made thinking about this.
Thank you so much. And again, challenging our assumptions and us learning from other people, because I would not even though we work in that way and we try and deliver our work in a way that is aware of trauma, is, you know, trauma informed and prioritizes safety, hadn't actually really appreciated just how valuable that was for the participants. So it's really lovely to hear that as your reflection. Thank you. And you've actually segued us into the second question that we had for you, which is, as somebody that does not work in adoption or children's social care, what were your key takeaways about adoption of Black communities? And you just, you know, started there saying you were astounded by the extent of the issue. Yeah, it would be great to hear more.
Yes. First of all, when I was in the room, I felt a sense of shame that I wasn't aware of it. That's the first thing I thought, oh my God, why has this never been in my purview? Why was I so, why was I in the dark? So I had to kind of process that. And then I thought, well, if I'm in the dark, we all have to have skin in the game. And that was the thing that came to me, that this is something that everyone needs to be aware of. Whether we choose to do something or what we can do, there needs to be an awareness within the Black community. And I say that because sometimes we spend a lot of time working on a problem, then the problem actually creates an aura. There's a whole language, there's a whole way of how this problem becomes other people talking about the problem. An example will be knife crime. You know, knife crimes happens in the Black community, whereas actually not necessarily. The highest amount of knife crime actually, I think, was in Glasgow. But the narrative and framing about it was never about knife crime in Glasgow. It's like knife crime in inner cities. So if we're not careful, we end up working a lot of problems, but actually the aura of that problem becomes like a problem in itself. And we don't see the positive resilience, the successes. And I think that is something, after reflection, I thought, okay, we need awareness, but also we need to hear those narratives and see those narratives of things that are working well, because that then shows the leadership and the empowerment within the Black community. Or else you have this feeling of dystopia, this feeling of burnout, this feeling of it's a big problem if we're not balancing out. And that's what I would kind of like to see of the problem. We're going to have the aura of the problem, but actually let's see powerful examples in parallel, really.
Thank you so much. So I just wanted to ask if the audience had any questions. Please do put them in the chat. But also, Bev, if you had any reflections on the theory of change process or some of the thoughts that Yewande just shared.
Yeah, Yewande, what you said really resonates with me, particularly the issue around the psychological safe space. You know, that becomes a huge context for entering this kind of work. I think the whole focus on the co-production in this project is there's so many strengths in it, but this is one of its real strengths, because you have a legitimacy. You know, you have a position and you get a set of positions because of the fact that you've taken that approach, which makes it a really powerful project with that potential it's got for the impact you want it to have, in terms of the objectives. I love the fact that you visualised it, because I've gone through that whole process that you described for your colleague Hannah, all of those post-it notes. But to end up with that visualisation just tells such an important story. But it says something important about where your care is in the process. Like, this is something that's really cared about. It's important to, get that communication, as you kind of referred to, right, So those are things that really kind of strike me. But just that the complexity of the story and the complexity of this space, because I'm going to say it a bit late in what you asked me, but it's a place where people like to go for a simplified explanation of what is a very complex set of pictures for what it means about Black children being Black adoption. It's people want to kind of reduce it to something quite simple. It's quite a complex story, and particularly some of the research we did at Nuffield. We pick up that there's a real complexity here. There are real gaps here that we need to get to. But yeah, I love the fact that you embrace the complexity, and you say, actually, the situation means that we have to be adaptive, and obviously emergence being part of that, because the context is changing around even the programme itself. There are questions here around the movement to children, focus on children staying with their families in their family homes, and what that means for a whole group of communities who are already de-recognised around informal kinship care and don't have the support, access to the support, don't have the funding, don't have all the things you need to care and address the needs of children with complexity when you're living in poverty, poor housing. And, then we've got this story of adoption, haven't we? You're thinking, God, what is it all going to mean when we're trying to push forward a form of permanency, which our young children have not had access to in ways that would have benefited many, So we it's a complex picture, and we need to maintain that kind of questioning all the time, and not just go for those simple sorts of ideas, because that doesn't help our children.
Thank you. There are two questions that I can see. One, I'm going to just ask you one day if you could offer a quick response, and the other, I think, between Lydia and Bev in particular, will be answered. So Maxine, thank you. Yewande, what were your views or perceptions of adoption prior to that, the Theory of Change meeting or workshop?
I didn't have any. It's just not. I don't have children. I don't have. I just had nothing. I had none at all. So that was why I said I felt a sense of shame that I didn't have any, because I had not encountered it. So yeah.
Amazing, thank you. So going to come to Lydia now to actually talk about the theory of change. And I note the question in the chat. So there are going to be questions we won't get to today, but we will collate and we can post answers to them when we post the recording. But we'll do our best to come to all of them at the end of this section. So I'll share my slides and hand over to you, Lydia.
Thank you, Laurelle. So I've got the privilege of sharing a little bit more detail with you about the illustration that we produced and the content contained in that. So if we move on. So back to our illustration, and what I'm going to do is just take you through some snapshots of different sections and pick out some of the most pertinent points and findings within this. So firstly, our strapline, our steering committee, that's part of our governance structure. It's made up of people with different personal experiences of adoption, Black adoptive parents, Black adopted people, professionals. They were really keen on the importance of having something clear and succinct that they could use to talk about what the project is to people and communicate it. The wording and the ideas for this came from the theory of change process, and actually the final decision was made by our Black adoptive parents stakeholder group. Creating better futures for Black adopted children in London. We wanted to really capture the fact that this project is not just about getting more Black adopters through our doors and approved. That's really important to try and address some of the disparities that we see in the opportunities for children with adoption plans. but it's also about improving the whole adoption journey and the experience through life, and particularly through childhood and adolescence for Black adopted children. And I think that one of the key really significant important reasons for that is because trust is something that we've identified is very missing, that in order for people to have that confidence to walk through the door to an adoption agency, to even consider such a huge undertaking as adopting a child who has had some really difficult life experiences, they need to have trust in the agency, they need to have trust in the process and in the kind of support or safety net that they may have around them in the future. So the project is not just about addressing that beginning, but it's about addressing the whole. And next, we've zoomed in on the barriers, and we felt that as part of this theory of change process, it was really important to clearly articulate what the actual problems are, what the barriers are, and not to assume, and this goes again to Yewande's point and the point in the chat question as well, that in children's social care and in adoption services, we're so immersed in what we know, and we forget that people who are not within these services don't understand or don't know what the barriers are. And so we wanted to really clearly articulate them. And as you'll see, there's a number of things that we raised there, and our research report particularly talks about our findings around the disparities in the likelihood of a Black child with an adoption plan going on to actually be placed for adoption. We see delays in them being placed, and that has an impact on the likelihood of that adoptive family being able to settle. But we also see that many more Black children do not find an adoptive family and remain in the care system, even though that was not the original plan for them. So that was a fundamental barrier, but significantly, we also felt that it was important to name racism and the impact of racism very, very clearly. This is something that's often skirted around, or maybe words that are dropped around without meaning or explanation. And we wanted to really clearly be able to talk openly and freely about the impact that racism and systemic racism has on all aspects of the adoption system. I think there was reference earlier to things like housing difficulties, employment. We know that there are systemic issues within our adoption systems, within our social care systems, but also within the society that we live in as a whole. The impact of systemic racism impacts how likely it is for a Black couple or a Black individual to be able to be in the sort of financial position, a position of stability to even consider adoption in the first place. So naming these things was really important to us. Next, goals. You have to know what you're trying to achieve. I think this was really difficult actually to summarize what we would want to see happen, what would look different. And we ended up finding that there were 5 natural areas of work that emerged. Families, children, communities, systems and support, and workforce. And so part of our theory of change goes into those individual areas and talks about what it is that we're hoping to see change in those areas. And I'm going to talk you through a few of those now. So children, Laurelle referred to the workshop that we had with some Black adopted young people, and this was really important in shaping some of the goals and the aims that we included in the theory of change, and that are now being included in some of the work that we have planned. The young people spoke particularly strongly about their feeling that they have a lot of support or understanding of their identity as adopted young people. We do life story work. There's lots of support for parents in helping young people think about their adoption identity, but they felt that they didn't have enough support thinking about their identity as Black young people and their place within Black history. and that be particularly relevant for them in adoption, because they may not be, even if they've been adopted into a Black family, that family might not share the same racial heritage or identity as them, and they wanted support with that to be integrated with that more general adoption life story support. They also spoke about the importance of adoption being recognised and valued in schools. That was a really key theme for them. Why isn't it spoken about as part of a normal family structure? And the importance for them of being connected with other adopted young people, but particularly other Black adopted young people. And we had some really strong feedback from parents whose young people attended, that even just attending this one session and feeling that they were needed to contribute their voices had a really powerful positive impact on them. And next, families. So we see, as I've mentioned earlier, that there are lots of constraints to adopting. The system is not built around Black families, and the system raises barriers, brings up barriers. And what we need to try and do in this project is to think about how we can lower those barriers and how we can help people to cross those barriers to come into adoption. And so that point again that I made earlier about trust in the system, but also practical support to minimize the impact of those barriers as well. People also spoke about the importance of hearing from others who had had positive experiences of fostering or adoption, and the impact that that has, as opposed to hearing just from an adoption service or a professional, in making them feel comfortable and confident to consider this as something that they might do as a family. And communities, I think some of what Yewande said really highlights our learning actually from that theory of change process in what we might need to do in the future to try to work genuinely, jointly and cooperatively with communities. And some of our key learning was in seeing the impact that providing that little bit of education about the problems that we see in the adoption system had. And it had a similar impact on everyone who attended as it did on Yewande, that people felt very, very motivated by hearing that there's a problem and we're trying to overcome it. And they wanted to be a part of the solution and finding answers. And so this has really helped us in our theory of change, thinking that we need to capture that kind of process in working in partnership with our communities as we move forward in trying to address these difficulties. And workforce. We know that our workforce is our key tool and strength in trying to achieve all of these things. And we need everybody within our organisations to feel fully equipped and really competent in supporting any family, but also in being able to specifically name and understand and think about the impact of racism and discrimination, and to think about the importance of identity when they're assessing families or supporting families who do not come from the same background as their own. And also really crucial within workforces for us to find and identify ways to better support our Black staff so that they so that we can slowly reach a point where we have that fully diverse and representative workforce at all levels of our organisation. And lastly, but not leastly, systems, maybe the more boring one, but we have so many things that we do automatically day in, day out, systems that have built up over long periods of time, and many of those systems may be part of the problem in creating barriers for Black families in our process and creating obstacles. And so this is about thinking about all of the things that we do, the normal things we do day to day, and thinking about how we might change those systems and processes so that our system becomes more welcoming, more open, more trustworthy for Black families that need to work with us at whatever part of the process. And we sum that up by talking about a reimagined system, a system that's reimagined to meet the needs of Black children. And our ultimate goal at the end of that long journey on our illustration, that Black children who need an adoptive family can have one. Again, something that our stakeholders were very involved in making a decision about the wording and the naming of that goal. And finally, our principles. So this was actually something that emerged really organically through the process. As we were working through everything, we found that we had naturally come across a set of principles about how we need to work within this project. And they're summarized here: evidence-informed, self-empowerment, authentic, embracing complexity, testing and learning, and anti-racist. But we use these to develop much more detailed principles that Laurelle's going to talk to you about now, that we intend to use throughout the project as we pilot opportunities for change, as we do more research, as we engage with people, trying to have that really clear set of principles that we can hold ourselves accountable to, was something that emerged as being really important. And Laurelle's going to talk to you a little bit about those principles.
Yeah, so just building on what Lydia said, the work that we've done with our stakeholders, with our partners, which includes community members, children, Black adoptive families, really has highlighted the need for us to be explicit about this first bullet point in particular. And when we kind of, I guess, try and articulate what is different about this, why is this not just another local authority partnership project with a consultancy? For us, this is one of the key things that differentiates us, because if you are familiar with working in local authority or even regional national government, this level of explicit articulation and focus often is not there. And that's certainly our experience as a consultancy that specialises in trying to affect often racial equity change. And that is understanding, first of all, the dynamic, the power imbalance, the impact of institutions on racial inequalities, racial discrimination, racial oppression, but also needing to continually reflect and hold ourselves to account on how we hold, share and use that power. And that can be very uncomfortable for organisations to do. We can all probably relate to this in the adoption sector in particular. We see predominantly white leadership, predominantly white women in children's social care leadership. And so what does that mean in terms of power, and what do we need to do to hold ourselves to account when we are trying to work collaboratively to improve outcomes for Black children and Black adoptive families? So recognising not only is it an institution, but institutions where the leadership primarily are racialised as white, the majority are racialised as white, working with Black children and communities. And so we have to create conditions for self-empowerment, challenge and leadership that's appropriate for that dynamic. And that's certainly well, it's not even just our experience. We've done some desktop literature reviewing. We know that is very unique, and we know that is also a challenge that we will constantly be trying to chip away at as we deliver this work. The other principles, you can watch back this video and read them in more detail. I'm not going to go through them all. I'll just focus on two more. Bullet point 3, we recognise the complexity of systems and society. We've already talked about this, but this really speaks to our approach and our methodology. We need to take an iterative approach because things are changing all the time. As Bev said, there's been so much change just in the time of this project already. And so we're learning, how do we be sufficiently agile, but also committing to specific tasks and activities, striking a balance and navigating complexity, and applying that in this work is a massive learning journey, and that we look forward to doing. And finally, that point underneath, we acknowledge that racism permeates all aspects of society. And again, this isn't a perspective necessarily agreed or subscribed to across all partners. I'm not specifically saying the Adopt London Alliance and partners there, but just generally, we know when working with certain bodies, there might be challenge in saying this as clearly, as explicitly. And one of our principles, however, is we acknowledge that in the project, because not only did people tell us that as their lived experience in the workshops, but we have evidence through our phase 1 research, there is a serious issue with racism impacting these Black children and these Black communities that want to adopt Black children. So we're proactive in our work to try and eradicate that as a core aspect of the work we're doing within this project. So the rest of the principles are on screen, and as I said, you can revisit later, but it would be great to hear from Bev. So over to you, Lydia.
Yes. Thank you, Bev. We wanted to ask you a couple of questions, and the first one was you recently published a really interesting article in Community Care, and we know that Nuffield have published a lot around racial disparities in care proceedings and children's social care systems. Do you think there's a need for more work specifically focused on Black racialized children's families and communities?
A simple answer to that is a definite yes. There's a definite need, a real need to bring the focus on the particular factors around racialisation that impact on the journeys of children and families and community. Is really important. It's not just in this space, it's actually across the board, but we're talking about this space today. We need to do this because we have to kind of, we've got somewhere in some understanding about what we know regarding race as a sort of social category and how it's playing out in some of the outcomes for groups of children, the stories of disparities, the overrepresentation or the underrepresentation. But we don't know very much beyond what we know, and yet we know that there is definitely a complexity here that we need to get to. We're still in a world, and I was thinking about this morning, a bit like Yewande, some notes are made. We're still living very much in this adoption story in the prism of the danger of the single story. The famous statement by the wonderful Chimamanda, where we are still holding on to a particular set of narratives, powerful views about adoption in our society that are imbued with the principles that you're identifying. They are imbued with what are racialized and sort of racist tropes around families, types of families. And it really matters, that we get to the research, because we have got systems that are creating poor outcomes for children and are actually doing harm to families. So it's necessary that we go deeper. I sort of argue very strongly, and I'm at the Nuffield really pushing the strong argument around intersectionality, as a foundation for supporting sort of research in this space. And you can see it yourself. You were very strong there, Laurelle, when you talked about the reality of making a statement that racism is embedded in our societies, and not everybody signs up to that. And we see the range of that, don't we? That continuum of outright hostility to these ideas, to in the other side of it, which is one of my concerns, which is a sort of simplification of what is a Black experience at the same time. So they work on this continuum. And for me, we need to get into that research that goes deeper into the key factors that we know are there. And we think about racialisation and its impact on different groups of children, Black children of mixed heritage, who are in different places and in different spaces, because we really need to bring that insight, because it will help us think about what actually is the messaging that we need to be pushing out here. What are the things we need to be creating? What are the pathways that we need to be creating, so we can get away from this idea that there's this sort of single Black experience, because it's actually very much more complicated than that. That I grew up in a system which is very much around, the Black families don't trust the system. That's still very much, you can see that in your work. Or Black families don't adopt because we don't want to take other people's children away from them. There's all of these ideas, and they're still very powerful. Yet, when you actually, as you've done, spend time with different people in different places, they're telling you something very different about what are the barriers to adoption. And it isn't, one of them isn't, we don't want to adopt our children. There's a lot of other things going on that are stopping that from happening. But yet that's still quite a powerful story and narrative that you hear sometimes in the system. So definitely yes to that, Lydia.
Thank you. Absolutely. And from your experience, what do you see as the key barriers for projects like the Black Adoption Project that are trying to use an action research approach and not a pure academic research approach?
I think you've laid it out there. you know, this, you know, getting research funding is a really complicated business, and you've got to just put a bit of a context around this. You know, that there's a story of sorts of discrimination and marginalisation of researchers who are exploring these questions with an intersectional or a non-Euro lens, white lens. Yeah, there's a real kind of resistance there anyway. And then when you're talking about using a sort of action research methodologies and co-production methodologies, for some institutions, this is stuff that they just haven't even today got an understanding of or a closeness to, or see this as something as non-rigorous, or not a methodology that they can engage with in their institutions. But that's not all institutions. There are some institutions that have actually grasped this and actually understand, actually, if we're going to have research that has an impact on policy and on practice and changes the lives of the people being researched, as it were, that we need to have a different way of looking at the way the work is produced, the kind of collaborations that come together. And so for me, it's around really working and understanding in this sector, where are those institutions and who are those funders, and how we create those networks and those connections to ensure that these kind of projects can get on a pathway to get some decent funding. And, you know, we know that there are funders who are really deeply thinking about how do they address institutional racism. I'm going to put it as it is, historical positions which have excluded these questions being explored, but also excluded these methodologies not being somehow of an empirical value in comparison to what we know is an empiricism, you know, written by, you know, put it bluntly, you know, a bunch of white men, you know, in the 19th century about what was seen to be evidence of value and importance and what wasn't. I mean, we've seen some really good, fantastic work like the Co-Power project that was funded by FRSA, which is a real foundational intersectional project, co-production project. So we know that there are institutions there that are trying to bring about a change. And on a practical level, there are barriers there, because there are practical things like, how do you ensure that your streams of funding enable people to navigate themselves through, because we haven't got the change we need. So how do you get and working ways to create pathways so people can navigate, get the support and get the input they need to be successful in their applications. And I know from where I sit in the Nuffield Foundation, there's a huge amount of work going on around that right now, around how we can develop those, because we know there are issues there. And there's a huge amount of work going on around intersectionality as a strategic objective for the Nuffield as well. So from where I sit, we are on a journey. But I see these barriers not about the work itself, not about the people coming forward. It's the institutions, it's the racialized structures, it's these problems that you hit, and it's then being able to build that network of support, networks of collaboration, so you can find your funding pots where you can find them to keep on going, because you demonstrate by the work you're doing and the outcomes that you're looking to achieve for your theory of change that, well, they missed the boat there, didn't they? They missed a great opportunity to do something really important, particularly when their systems are sort of saying we're about welfare and we're about supporting families, or whatever the research funder is particularly interested. You know, so for me, you know, those are some of the barriers that projects like these can hit, but I also want to be hopeful, because I know that they spark a huge amount of debate within institutions, and they touch on what some institutions have already got to, like the Wellcome, that created a huge program of funding. The Nuffield is looking at a huge program around these questions in the next few months being published. So, you know, you bring a challenge to these institutions, and you help, if I may say so, people like myself who kind of walk in there and have been arguing from day one, you know, what are we doing here? You know, so it's and all those great researchers out there, those professors that are still with us, who have been battling away for years to get these questions funded and properly supported. But yeah, so thank you to BAP for you and what you're doing, because you're bringing a challenge to so many people, and that's been fantastic.
Thank you, and that's really encouraging to hear as well about some of the, you know, some of the change that is happening in the system. And like you say, all these systems are so interlinked, aren't they, that change needs to happen across so many different systems in order for us to see the work create real change and lasting change, particularly.
That's right.
Laurelle, we've got a couple of minutes left. Have we got any other questions that we might be able to cover?
Linda, are you able to unmute? I don't know, because there's been quite a few coming in, so I imagine we've only got time for one. For Bev, are you there, Linda? I'm scrolling at the same time. Okay, I'm going to just pick one. So, okay. This one, Bev, you'll be able to pick up quite easily, I imagine. So is it true to this day? I imagine this may have been the case in the past that adopters have a choice as to what gender or race they wish to adopt. And what is the percentage of Black children who get rejected by non-Black families on adoption registers? So you might not be able to give a percentage, but the choice, how much choice do people generally have around what gender or race they wish to adopt?
Yeah, well, it's ultimately always the adopter's decision,
That's
the
right.
prospective adopter's
Yeah.
decision about adopting a child. No one would ever be, forced or coerced into adopting a child that they didn't feel completely confident was the right match for their family. And some adopters decide that they, for whatever reasons, they are very specific about the gender, the age, the heritage of the child that they wish to adopt. And some adopters feel very open about that. And many adopters change their view during the assessment process as well, hearing from the perspectives of families who have already adopted, hearing from adoptees and professionals. Many people don't end up in the same position that they started in with that. So yeah, in terms of the outcomes for children and that sort of selections process, I think we'll put a link in the chat to our research report, and that really highlighted just the difficulties in having enough families for us to really make sure that we're choosing the right matches for our Black children. Particularly, there just aren't enough for us to be making those right decisions. Bev, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I go with what Lydia said there. I mean, it's ultimately a doctor choice. And you've got to think about what motivates people to want to come forward for a family and to create a family, which is the driver for most people. And, it's just an everyday human thing that you want to be adopting children that are like you or come from places that could be like you. That's just a natural process. I think where we've got a difficulty is that we have a sort of piece of legislation that talks about not thinking about some of those things on matching, but the reality is, I think in practice, is that actually, how many people do come through and want something different? I mean, these are the things that we want research a bit more, don't we, to get some questions about that. But the reality is that the intention of that legislation was to sort of, ensure that more Black children got adopted. And we know 10 years later, we're in this. We've got this project because we've got a real crisis of Black children not getting an option of permanency adoption. And there are other little barriers that go on within adoption. There's the interagency adoption stuff, Lydia, that can create barriers. There's a lot of complexity. That means that we don't get to put children aren't with families. Families aren't able to sort of meet the needs of children that need adoption. But the fundamentals are there in the project. The fundamental barriers are those are the ones that we need to address.
And you reference more research, and I'll just add that one of our findings was actually a surprise to us, that despite the shortage of Black adoptive parents being approved, they didn't get matched with children any quicker than other adopters did. And that's something that we're going to be looking into researching and
very
exploring a bit further, because these things are all really really significant, really, in helping us understand the experience of Black adopters and why we see the disparities that we see.
And when you speak to Black adopters in the process and on that personal level, I have friends who have gone through the process, and some of the stuff that they're dealing with is out and out racist practice. You get me? That just means that they've had to dig in to keep going, because some of the practices around the perceptions of family life, etc., are still there. Some of the
just quickly, Yewande wanted to come back on your point, Bev, and then we'll have to wrap up, I'm afraid. Yewande, do you want to come in?
Very quickly, I just want to say, being in academia, that participatory research, action research is what's in now. That's the future. Anyone that's not doing that is still stuck in research for research.
Yeah,
sake.
I'm with you there, Yewande. I'm with you there 100%.
I just wanted to finish that note that is very positive. It's out there for the grabbing now.
That's right, yeah. And that's why I think we are seeing these changes in the institutions outside of the universities starting to really get their heads into, actually, we've got to be in a place that's going to have impact to make the difference. You've got to justify those existences, haven't you? You've got to be able to demonstrate what your funding and what your commission is going to bring about. You know, some of those fundamental changes that we need.
We've got too many problems in the world. Climate change, so many problems now that actually to solve those problems, we need participation, we need action research. The whole epistemology of how we do research is shifted. I just wanted to let people know that you guys are ahead of the game.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you
totally.
for those,
100% agree.
Thank you for those final points. That's really helpful and encouraging, really encouraging as well. We're out of time. It's gone really fast. I hope that it's been really valuable for everyone who came. I've certainly really enjoyed it, and it's been fantastic hearing Yewande and Beverley's points. And we want to thank you again for giving up your time and your expertise being with us today. Please, there's a feedback link, a very brief feedback link in the chat. If you do have a moment, please fill it in, because we will be using that and all of the other comments and the questions in the chat to make sure that the next webinar is as helpful as possible for you. We will be having another webinar in a couple of months. If you haven't already signed up to our newsletter, there's also a link to sign up to that to make sure that you hear about the next webinar. And we look forward to seeing you all again really soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a privilege to be part of this today and to meet you as well, Yewande. Hopefully I can reach out to you as well. I'd love to have a chat.
Thank you so much.
Yes,
take care.
thank you.
Thanks ever so much, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye. Well done, brilliant. Thank you.